Hussain now. He's going to be speaking about a subject called the future that did not happen. The ruins of progress on the Bangladesh-India border. This is from fresh research, so actually I'll leave it to you.
It is fresh, but you know, like I'm sure many of you who have done this sort of work, they take a very long time to do. So actually, I started doing this in 2005 or 2006, and it started off life as a master's project, and then it continued into my PhD. Which I finished last year. So the thing that I'm going to present today is, well, the extracts from the book that is coming on the back of the PhD. So, so it's gone through many changes, many transformations from being this kind of strict academic thing to something that is, I hope, something a bit more easily accessed, and I was in a bit of stress with regards to what to present. So the title that Ahmadullah just read out is actually one of the titles of one of the chapters. But a few days ago, some of my personal advisors suggested I don't just read out one of my chapters, which is what the traditional thing to do in academic settings is. And what I was advised was to possibly do extracts from the book, which is I've never done, and it might not sound very novel to you if you've attended these sorts of things, but it's a new thing for me. So yes, this thing is going to be extracts from the book, accompanied by loads of pictures, which might make it a bit more kind of palatable as well. And there is no real order to the images, but if there's any questions about the images as well, I'm sure we can talk about them during the Q&A. So the story that I'm trying to tell is based where the arrowhead is, and there are two names that you should keep in mind. One is Borapani, and the other is Konigat. So Borapani and Konigat is a very small, remote area on the border between, obviously, Bangladesh and India. And on the Bangladeshi side, it's in the district of Sylhet in Sunamganj. And on the Indian side, it's in the state of Meghalaya. Essentially, Borapani was divided in two at partition. When the British were retreating, they carved up the Indian subcontinent into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority East and West Pakistan. So Borapani was this area that was carved up. So one side went to India, and the other side went to what was then East Pakistan, that later became Bangladesh. I spent a year and a half living in this area, collecting stories and oral histories of the people who live and work here. And I had initially gone there because I wanted to write about the fence that India was building around Bangladesh. And I read huge amounts about the border between the US and Mexico, the Israel-Palestine war, and I wanted to write about what was going on in this kind of very kind of distant part of the world in between Bangladesh and India. Now, the border region of Bangladesh and India, they might sound remote to us here, but they are also incredibly remote to people in those places as well. So places, people who live in Dhaka or Sylhet or Delhi or Calcutta, for them the border regions are very, very far-flung places as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that on the Indian side, it's all hills. And you'll see the pictures in a bit. So that if you see hills, think it's India. If it's flat, it's Bangladesh. So the border runs through in between the hills and the plains. So it's not just an international border, and it's not just one that is in theory supposed to divide Bangladeshis from Indians, but it's also other forms of borders that are taking place here. So the physical ones between the hills and the plains as well. And traditionally, or historically, the hills were inhabited by Garo and Kashi communities, indigenous communities, and the plains were inhabited by migrant Bengalis. This area is, on both sides, it's sparsely populated. So even though we're talking about Sylhet, I was probably the only Sylheti there. Most people are, in fact, from other parts of Bangladesh, from neighboring districts who come here to work specifically in this area. So, okay. So Borapani was divided in two at partition in 1947. As a result, one half of Borapani went to India and the other to East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. So the fact that this is a border is one feature of this story, or this narrative, that I want to tell, and is very much a feature of the lives of the people here. Another feature is mineral extraction. So in the past, and even in pre-colonial times, limestone was mined in the hills. And the industry continued during the British period, when the limestone was sent to the colonial metropolis of Calcutta to build the capital city of the Raj. And then during the East Pakistan period, a major limestone industry was built next to Borapani to supply the country's growing need for raw materials as it developed. Later, this was shut down by the then Bangladeshi government in the 1990s. So, though limestone was, and limestone is still found here, the limestone has been seeded by another thing, which is coal. So coal is, in fact, what draws thousands and thousands of people to this region every year. And coal, or what is sometimes referred to with irony around these parts as kaloshuna, which is black gold, is what everyone is chiefly interested in. The coal trade between the Indian side, who export it, and the Bangladeshi side, who import it, is the industry here. Traditionally inhabited by the indigenous Garo and Kashi communities, the hills, where all the mines are located, remain sparsely populated, which means a scarcity of labour. This draws in the migrant labourers from all over Bangladesh, who cross the border illegally to work in the mines. Ironically, the trade itself is legal, so the people who work in it and what they're doing is illegal, but to trade in coal is legal. So there's paperwork and taxes paid and permits required and that sort of thing. Yeah. So a good place to start is, as always, at the beginning, and in this case it is my own start, or rather introduction to Borapani and then later Konigat. I should say, so as the hills, India, plains are Bangladesh. Borapani is located on the other side of these trees, and this side is Konigat. This is Konigat and Borapani during the rainy season, if anyone who is familiar with this part of the world, will know that Cherrapunji is just above in the hills. And Cherrapunji a few years ago, I don't think it no longer is, was the wettest place on earth. So all the water that comes down from Cherrapunji comes straight into this part of Bangladesh. And so this is that water. And the water stays there for about half of the year. But instead of the floods being a disaster, here it is in fact very much utilized by the local people, because this is precisely when the coal is transported out of the area. So the rainy season is when the majority of the work is done. This is the dry season. This is a section from one of the chapters. So Indian and Bangladeshi Borapani are located in extremely remote and isolated parts of both countries. The journey from Dhaka city is slow and tiring. An overnight bus northeast to Sylhet, a 3-hour rickety bus ride to Sunamganj town, a slow and noisy boat ride across the Shurma River, and then a bumpy 2-hour journey on the back of a motorbike over unpaved paths, through tangled bamboo groves and sleepy bazaars and hamlets. As I get closer to the hills, and with it the border, there are scenes of men in riverbeds collecting stones that have come down from the hills, and women sieving sand. These are essential ingredients in the building of cities elsewhere in the country. The blue limestone West Kashi hills are spectacular. They are not very tall, but it is their sheer breadth that makes them look magnificent. Initially, I assumed that the hills act as a natural boundary against the plains, which is why, over the centuries, borders have continuously been redrawn here. It doesn't take long to realize how futile this endeavor is. Rather than preventing connections between both sides, the hills actually enable, facilitate, and even provide the motives for the interconnections in the first place. In the dry season, which is when I arrive, the wetlands on the Bangladeshi side are devoid of water. Rice had been planted, and the sheaves were acid green. Occasionally, a human head or two could be seen bobbing up and down amongst the fluttering tips. It will be a few months later that I experience the full force of the climatic orchestra that plays out here annually. During the monsoon, it rains for days and nights without abating. The sound is deafening. Rainwater, as well as the bloated rivers and streams that emanate from the hills, come straight down into the plains. As they do so, the waters slowly colonize each and every stretch of land, including the fields where the paddy grow. Soon, there will be water as far as the eye can see. The occasional homestead, built on raised land, look like floating islands. The water is the color of grey slate. Often the sky reflects onto the still waters, making it difficult to see where one ends and the other begins. So those few pictures that I showed before, you can see the contrast in the same kind of geography, and how during the year the landscape changes so dramatically. This picture is the 0 point. So occasionally I might mention the 0 point. This is the 0 point. So as you know, the coal is all on the Indian side, and it is they who export it, and it comes into Bangladesh. So these trucks are waiting to be processed. Their paperwork is waiting to be processed for them to be able to come into the Bangladeshi side. Borapani Bazaar is at the center of the Bangladesh-India coal trade in this part of the border region. It has the impermanent feel of a frontier town, a scene out of a country and western film, though the usual noise, people, frenetic hurriedness of other rural Bangladeshi bazaars is evident here. It is teeming with thousands of dark-skinned, gaunt labourers, a fretwork of bones protruding out of their sweaty, taut muscles, their backs and hamstrings tight in desperate effort. I jump out of their way as they push, lug, heave and pull carts laden with bulky sacks of coal towards the river. Soot has ground itself into their skin, and it clouds the paths they walk on. The men speak a mixture of languages, some which I recognize and others I don't. Their homes, made out of corrugated sheets of tin, mud and bamboo, are scattered around the outskirts of the Bazaar. Indian Borapani can easily be seen from the Bangladeshi side, only a few meters ahead. So so you can see the homes of Indian Borapani on the other side. Though the no man's land that divides both parts is clear of buildings and structures, the other side looks as scruffy and raucous as here. Little huts covered in blue tarpaulin dot the hills. People walk about, going about their business, working, laughing and drinking tea in the same way they do here. But an invisible force field seems to stop anyone from crossing the border. Is this a result of history, nationalism, or just the threat of violence that produces this? It only applies to people on foot, however, because every so often, heavy trucks lumber into Bangladeshi Borapani with coal on their backs. The Kashi men who drive them have the crucifix dangling from their necks and painted on the side of their noisy juggernauts. What country do these men belong to? Children and women wearing tattered clothes and thick soot run after the vehicles as they cross into Bangladesh. A troop of Bangladeshi border guards in camouflage uniforms, berets and rifles bid goodbye to an Indian border security force guard, a Sikh, on the other side. Having just finished their shift at the 0 point, they head towards their barracks, looking tired and bored rather than full of purpose or nationalist zeal. Borapani was exciting from the offset. It had the same raffish quality about it that border towns tend to have. I immediately had many questions about the place and its people, but there were some problems that needed resolving before I could think about relocating here. Firstly, I had come to the border to study how historically constituted connections are being transformed in the wake of the fencing of the border. But other than the makeshift bamboo barrier at the 0 point, there is nothing else here. This will not be a problem, I realize. The fence is clearly on its way. The road that has been dug on the hillside attests to this. Now, instead of my work being just about the fence, the border and the relationship locals have to it, it will be able to encapsulate what life is like before the fence turns up, and also the process of it being constructed. The second problem is legalities. As a British citizen, it is illegal for me to be in the border region, and getting official permission was going to be complicated. I didn't want to have to spend all my time in traffic jams in Dhaka, waiting for bureaucratic acceptance. Not a problem, the Bangladeshi friend who initially introduces me to the area says. As someone whose family is from Sylhet, you are not that much of a foreigner anyway, he says. I attempt to protest. But it was my grandfather who had left Sylhet when it was part of the British Empire. Since then, there have been 3 generations of my family here in the UK. My friend laughs. This doesn't matter. Once a Sylheti, always a Sylheti. Nonetheless, I am able to be here without raising too many suspicions on account of my physical features, which are supposedly quintessentially Bengali. My Bangla is also adequate. My friend tries to further alleviate my concerns. Look around you, he says. Everyone here is busy doing something that they probably shouldn't be doing. You are the least threatening out of the lot. So by joining a multitude of other activities and people in Borapani that may be strictly illegal but somewhat locally permissible, my second problem is ameliorated. However, 6 months after arriving in the area, I was arrested and taken to camp by a Bangladeshi border guard for allegedly being an Indian smuggler. I telephoned my friend, who managed to placate the commander of the camp by explaining that I am not Indian, but from the UK, and that my family originated from Sylhet. The commander, whose moustache took up nearly half of his face, diffusing any sense of fear that the incident may have had, accepts this. He allows me to stay on condition that I do not attempt to cross the border, stay out of trouble, and do not drink the smuggled Indian whiskey. The final difficulty that needs resolving is finding somewhere to stay. Borapani is not a place one can live in easily. There is little spare housing, no electricity, no clean drinking water or sanitation. Locals also say that because of the alcohol smugglers, it isn't very safe for someone to live alone. Again, my friend provides a solution. He suggests I live in the fenced-off perimeters of the Konigat limestone mining project. To begin with, I had not been able to differentiate between Borapani and Konigat, the latter where I do indeed end up living. Also, on the Bangladeshi side of the border, I assume the two are neighbouring villages. In many respects, that is certainly what they are. The inhabitants of the two places are Bengali and largely Muslim, though there are significant Hindu populations in both. However, the people and place of Borapani could not be any more different to Konigat, which until relatively recently played a small role in a larger plan that was to revolutionize the entire country. A lake separates the two places, acting as a buffer, both physical and symbolic, between the contrasting narratives Borapani and Konigat had to tell about one another. While the coal village is teeming with life and activity, Konigat is its exact opposite. It is eerily quiet and looks like an abandoned ghost town. There is little sign of any of the grime and bustle of the coal trade here. Instead, scattered around the insides of the perimeters of the fence are the skeletons and entrails of a decomposing industrial past. Large debris of rusting machinery, lines of railway tracks, and disintegrating earth diggers lie strewn around. A massive metal crane perches gracelessly at the main entrance. The remnants act as an allegory of the collapse of the ideology that once created and sustained Konigat. The houses, all concrete buildings, built uniformly and painted the same colour, are largely derelict. Around the central lawn are official-looking buildings closed down long ago. Everything seems to have been organised and planned here once, but have since fallen apart. Like all deserted places of the imagination, it also has few inhabitants that actually live here. People of working age have left. There is something very sad about Konigat, a sense of decay hanging over it. Though I came here to study the border and the fence, these two separate and interweaving spaces, Konigat and Borapani, the distinct groups of people that occupy them, what they represent, were to form the actual basis of my book. It is by exploring their own particular histories, the thoughts of people who live in either place, about themselves and each other, that I was able to learn about the contemporary realities of the Bangladesh-India border, and indeed, something about the wider world and how it makes itself felt in this very remote part of it. So that's a tiny bit from one of the chapters. The next section gives you a little snapshot of what this thing, the Konigat limestone mining project was. This massive industrial site that found itself on the border between Bangladesh and India. And when I went there, it was in total, in this kind of, as I say, it looked like a ghost town, and it looked totally incongruous to everything around it. So Borapani had thousands of people who come here to work in the coal trade, and it was bustling and busy, and just next to this was this kind of derelict industrial site. Established in 1965, the Konigat limestone mining project was one of many other large-scale industrial sites set up by the then Pakistani government to furnish the new independent country with raw materials. It was considered crucial for newly decolonized countries to be independent, not only of British rule, but also each other, or at the very least be seen to be so. The fact that East Pakistan was until then still reliant on limestone from India was therefore disconcerting for its new leaders. As soon as it was built, new opportunities began opening up, and soon the demography of Konigat and the border began changing. Much of it was unprecedented in scale. Land was allocated beside the border to assemble the project colony. Quarters were constructed to house the officers and labourers arriving from neighbouring districts. Roads and communication links to Sunamganj and Sylhet were established. A school was built, as was a clinic, water and electricity supply, graveyard, post office, bank and guest house. A mosque was constructed, as was a Hindu temple. Whilst the officers had their clubhouse with weekly leisure activities to amuse them, the lower ranking employees had an entertainment building. It was not just the built environment that was changing. A new social order began to crystallize, and an organized and regimented lifestyle was forming. This included a trained labor force, health and safety regulations, set wages, trade unions, and fixed working hours. Now, at this point, I mean, some of the things that are taking place in the news, this story should run counter to that. I mean, one of the things that we've become quite used to hearing is that apparently in Bangladesh there are no regulations to protect workers. But of course, these things existed and still exist. And so the Konigat limestone mining project, set up in the 1960s, actually implemented these things. And this is why this project was such a kind of beacon in many ways. Modernization was expected to transform society and the individual in the same way it had done so in the West. These notions were considered to be vital for the new economy, but also for the new society, eradicating poverty and backwardness all at the same time. The project became a coveted posting, as employees and their families were well looked after. The security and safety nets provided were luxuries lower-ranking workers would never have experienced previously. The technology, the reliable source of limestone and labour, and the ideological incentives meant increased output, and soon the project began to play its role in Pakistan's larger industrial revolution. Talk of the Pakistani miracle began to surface. For a while at least, the optimism seemed to herald transformations that had once occurred in the industrialization of Western countries. Joshim's uncle is in his mid-30s. Today, he is a coal labor leader. He hires men and women to dig on the Bangladeshi side of the no man's land for low-grade coal, which he then sells onto the larger import depots. Joshim's uncle's father was a project labourer on the limestone rail tracks for more than 10 years. He had retired by the time it closed down, receiving a generous pension. Joshim's uncle recalls with pride how exclusive and exclusionary the project was. And so this is him talking. The entire area was completely different then, nothing like it is now. The officers all lived in the bungalows. Their wives would play badminton in the gardens and on the lawn. No one was allowed to enter the project gates without permission. Not even the border guards were allowed. Street lights would be seen from the middle of the wetlands. They were that powerful. I remember 3 men would clean their outside areas, picking up litter and rubbish throughout the day. But look at it now. Cattle roam around, eating the flowers off the trees. People transport coal through it. Even the NGOs who operate within project territory would never have been allowed to do so then. It is nothing like it was. People knew Konigat before, not anymore. The border guards just wander around whenever and wherever they want. This is the reality of what has happened here. End of quote. A number of things occurred for the project to close down in 1993. With over-extraction of limestone, the seams ran too low for the existing machinery to reach. As a result, production slowed down and losses mounted. At the same time, the liberalization of the Indian economy meant that it became financially prudent to import limestone from India rather than purchase new technology that extracted at much lower depths. Lastly, with the Bangladeshi state finding itself heavily dependent upon foreign aid, organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF had been forcing both democratic and military rulers, Bangladeshi rulers, to liberalize the economy and to accelerate privatization projects and structural adjustment programs. As a result, the project closed down. While some of the infrastructure was dismantled and machinery sold off or transferred to other state-run installations around the country, most remain where they were left on the last day of operations. Cranes, railway tracks and carriages, large metal containers, earth diggers and tractors continue to litter the borderland to this day. The cross-border coal trade on the Bangladeshi side is monopolized by men who were formerly limestone labourers at the bottom of the project hierarchy. So the reason why the story of Konigat is important for the story, this other story of the coal, is because the coal trade is run by the very men who were whose jobs were lost when the project closed down. So the project closes down, and these people all move to this neighbouring village of Borapani and take over the coal industry. So the two industries are very kind of intertwined, and their relationship are quite important because whereas once upon a time the project offered all of these benefits, today the coal industry offers nothing. And the coal industry is very similar to what we've been reading about in Dhaka and the garments industry there, and large-scale industry elsewhere in Bangladesh. So this idea that Bangladesh needs to come into the future and start bringing out more regulation to protect its workers, as I repeat, this stuff has happened in the past. The next section, or the next extract, is about the coal industry itself, and I'll read out two extracts. The first is based on the experiences of a 20-year-old Bangladeshi called Sujon, and it's his tale of illegally crossing the border to work in the Indian mines. The second section is of coal heavers, both male and female, operating on the Bangladeshi side of Borapani. So this is the first section. The trade in coal begins its journey high up in the searing, hot, dark and claustrophobic mine shafts, scattered like honeycombs throughout the West Kashi hills. Young Bangladeshi men cross the line of demarcation every day to work illegally in them. Many also live in temporary coal camps in the hills, moving from one to another on a semi-permanent basis if and when an excavation project is complete. When large numbers of workers are required, the border guards of both sides are paid by the Indian managers of the mines to facilitate this. The Bangladeshi men are part of a larger group of migrant workers from other parts of the subcontinent. Some of these people will be part of a historically constituted tradition of seasonal labour migration to the region. The Indian exporters for whom they work and will probably never meet tend to be West Bengali, Marwari and Assamese businessmen working alongside a Kashi or a Garo shadow partner. Known as rat hole mining, a tunnel is punched into the side of the hill through which the miners crawl in one at a time. The coal seams may be anything between 5 meters or 100 meters deep inside of the rock. The entire process is unmechanized, and the coal is brought out using wheelbarrows. Amongst the Bangladeshi workers, the experienced ones may work as supervisors, the literate ones as bookkeepers. The majority of them, however, work as colliers. Sujon is in his late 20s and a descendant of the Konigat limestone mining project. His family now own a small clothes shop in the Bazaar, which they set up after the project shut down. He believes the owners of the mines prefer to hire Bangladeshis because they don't drink as much alcohol as the other workers do. The Kashi men apparently drink whiskey like it is tea, he said. The Bangladeshis also apparently don't get into fights and disputes. His family business is in fact where Sujon met the owner of the mine he worked for. This man was originally from Assam in India, and he had crossed the border into Bangladeshi Borapani to do some shopping. He was also on the lookout for new workers. He had a temporary government lease to extract coal from a site around 3 hours north of Indian Borapani. He met Sujon and set about persuading him to work for him. Owing to the latter's slight frame, the owner promised him a writing job in the enterprise. Because of the dangers involved, Sujon's parents refused. There was a row, but the young man had always wanted to go up into the hills, and this was his opportunity to do so. He snuck across the border in the cab of a coal truck, which had come to the Bangladeshi side to drop off its load. The border guards did not see him or the 4 other Bangladeshis hiding in it. Living in what he describes as a jungle, all day long, while the other workers hewed coal in the shaft with only a scarf over their mouths to protect their lungs, Sujon would sit outside the opening and record the amount of coal extracted, those men who had been remunerated, and calculate debts that needed paying. When one truck was filled and drove off in the direction of Borapani, another arrived needing to be fed. Much of the time, Sujon would spend trying to get reception on his mobile phone so that he could talk to his girlfriend in Konigat. At night, all of the workers slept together on bamboo mats on the ground. In solidarity with his Muslim Bangladeshi workmates, Sujon, a Hindu, refused to eat the pork the Kashi men cooked, sticking to the fish and vegetables instead. The 250 rupees a day he earned was a tidy sum of money by the end of the month, which is the length of time he worked, as he missed his girlfriend terribly and wanted to see her again. The slim-built, well-groomed young man is hardly typical of those who cross the border every day to work in the coal mines, risking dignity, life and limb. The majority of the workers who do so are unskilled, illiterate migrants who work to supplement the desperate incomes in rural areas where poverty, hunger and exploitation are everyday realities. Sujon's family business, on the other hand, is reasonably profitable. His experience of working in the mines sounds more like a boy's own escapade rather than the narratives that are generally associated with illegal cross-border labour migration. In particular, when he was retelling the incident about the young Kashi woman who approached him and asked if he would like to sleep in her hut at night, it did seem a little fanciful. But the reason Sujon rejected her, he says, was that he feared the wrath of the other miners who may attack him. The Kashi men because she was their own, and the Bangladeshis because they were jealous of the attention he received and would accuse him of rocking the boat. This is not to say that amorous dealings do not occur. There are many men in Bangladeshi Borapani who have married women from the other side, whom they met whilst working there. Some have gone to the extent of converting to Christianity, the majority religion of the Kashis and the Garos. Sujon's account is not intended to undermine the drudgery involved in such dangerous work. The miners work in dark, intensely hot, humid and cramped caverns, sometimes in pools of water for long hours in constant danger and uncertainty. Many workers have malaria and back and chest problems. One cannot know the full extent of disabilities, injuries, and even deaths that occur in the coal mines in the West Kashi Hills. Around the world, underground coal shafts are more dangerous and claim more victims than all other underground mines put together. Risks come from mine collapse, methane explosions, carbon monoxide poisoning, and also carbon monoxide poisoning and the slow debilitating effects of lung damage from rock and coal dust. The chance of dying is also 4 times greater for a worker in an Indian mine than in any other industry. But here, on the Bangladesh-India border, it is the more prosaic risks that miners fear most, such as drunken disputes with other workers, resolved through fighting. Sujong says that this is what he feared the most, that another worker who did not like him for whatever reason may stab him. This is not such an unreasonable concern. Alcohol plays a pivotal role in the borderlands, both economically, with a large-scale trade in smuggled goods, as well as socially. Public inebriation is widespread. Indian border security force raids are also something that Bangladeshi workers dread. Their precarious position in India heightens fear that naturally pervades the mine. A Sylheti journalist, whose beat covered northern Sunamganj, told me that many men die in the mines every month. Unable to bring their bodies back across the border, burials are carried out in the hills by fellow miners. Numbers are impossible to ascertain as they go unreported. In any case, as illegal migrant workers, whom does one report to anyway? Families are rarely informed, the nameless, illiterate victims having originated from isolated villages dotted around the country. So that's a tiny bit about what happens on the Indian side of the border in the mines themselves. So this section is what happens on the Bangladeshi side as once the coal is brought through. Coal heavers begin their day at sunrise when the temperature is most bearable to work. A straight line of dust and the faint sound of deep groaning accompany the thousands of men heaving overburdened pushcarts from the coal depots towards the direction of the riverbank. From here, it is taken out by boats and delivered to larger barges that transport the goods throughout the country. On closer inspection, the workers, all male and below 40 years of age, including boys, weariness, sleep and physical exhaustion still in their eyes, haul anything up to 8 sacks of coal. Each weighs roughly 25 kg. The physical toll means that the old, infirm and disabled are disqualified and have to find work in the unorganized informal sector alongside women. As one pulls the wooden vehicle along the unpaved path, panting and sweating, trying to navigate past the pock-marked paths that could overturn the load, another pushes with all his might, making sure the sacks don't topple over. So normally on these push cars, 2 people work together. So one will push and the other one will pull. They are dressed in shirts and cotton trousers, the fashion of early morning city workers. Most are barefoot or wear frayed leather rubber sandals. None of these labourers wear scarves around their mouths, as it makes breathing impossible. This early in the day, with the temperature not so high, and even in the winter, when they are all swathed in scarves and jumpers to ward off the cold, the perspiration on their sun-blackened faces is a testament to how unforgiving a job this is. They earn by the amount of times they ferry the sacks from the depots to the riverbank, from where they refill and make the journey back again. Taking a day off for illness, pain, or physical weariness means that they do not earn. It is around 80 taka per drop, so that's around 70p. The fit and healthy can expect to make around 300 taka per day, so around £2.70. Those depots further away from the river pay a little more. What they take home is much less, as they have to buy or rent the pushcart, and the costs for fixing the wheels every week or so come out of that amount. In a country with such high population density and chronic unemployment, the there are always people desperate enough to work long hours in harsh surroundings for relatively little money. Consequently, there has been little incentive to improve health and safety conditions, raise wages, or to provide any social benefits such as accommodation, health, or educational facilities. Strategies once, in an earlier time, used by the Konigat limestone mining project to retain workers. Labour in the coal industry remains unregulated. The sole purpose of the Borapani Coal Importers Association is for the owners of the import companies to air their grievances and to rally behind if and when exporters, the Bangladeshi and Indian border guards, make unreasonable demands. The association is not for the labourers who actually work for them. These workers could be said to be very much locked into a total system, the aim of which is to exploit resources and labour. Female labourers line the route of the formal trade from the 0 point onwards, scavenging for bits of coal that have fallen off the back of the trucks. Outside of the depots, women squat on the dusty ground, sweeping dirt up into a pan, which they then sieve for bits of coal. Along the path the pushcarts take to the river, women and children zigzag in between them, collecting stray bits that have tipped out. During the monsoon, a stream formed behind the bungalow I lived in, heralding a constant traffic of labourers with fishing nets, wicker baskets and other agricultural utensils that have been adapted for coal collection. Night and day, women in sodden, brightly coloured saris collect, dig, screen, load, sift and sack the black stuff. Organised by labour leaders, the low-grade coal, known as Bangla, as it is found on the Bangladeshi side of the border, is sold onto coal depots where they mix it with higher-grade Indian coal. Based on the numbers of sacks filled, workers earn between 200 and 300 taka per day. There are numerous children who are known as helpers, also involved in the work. At night, I hear their chatter and occasional laughter as they go about their work. Once, I heard a woman shouting, presumably at her husband. She had a baby on her hip and a naked toddling one following behind. "He just hit me on my hips," she cried to no one in particular. "That's why I'm living away from him. If he doesn't want to look after them, then I can do it very well myself. I can work and feed them." End of quote. This form of coal collecting is illegal because they are operating along the border on the prohibited no man's land, as well as the fact that there is no paperwork involved or taxes paid. As the evening settles in and all the boats leave, the coal depot area is quiet. Most of the men are in the bazaar drinking tea, socializing and gossiping. Project residents, so Konigat Limestone Mining Project residents, promenade along the quarry lake, gazing benevolently at the heavers who wash their pushcarts and then themselves in the water. A few coal depot managers potter around the 0 point, talking to their Indian counterparts on their mobiles. It is the women who remain in the depot area, continuing to sweep up the remnants of the day's spillages. They remain the most vulnerable out of all the migrants who flood into the area to feed the trade with cheap and expendable labour. Some of them are in the river, the water as black as coal, fishing out chunks. They work the longest hours for the least amount of money. Most are filthy, their saris torn. Work does not end when they get home, where they will do the cooking, washing, and other domestic and caring work. I notice a woman, a regular in the depot area, who has a skin disease around her legs. She collects coal soot with her 6-year-old daughter. The woman has gold earrings on, probably her only asset. At least she has something that gives her some self-respect, I think. These are all people who are part-time farmers and fisherfolk. They come to the borderlands for money, and as a result have radically transformed their connection to a cycle that had once given their lives a semblance of meaning. The land, the water, loved ones, seasons. Now they have become a reusable, disposable part in a large, dirty industrial machinery where they process coal in order to fulfill the hopes and desires of a growing metropolis elsewhere. What are their hopes, I wonder? Living a life free of illness and hunger? Their deaths in the mines go unnoticed. Labourers are simply replaced. So the last section is, so I suppose the first few sections give this kind of very large overview of the landscape, the work, the kind of background, political, economic stuff that is taking place here. The last extract that I'll read is something about the kind of intimate and personal lives that have developed of the people who live and work here. So far I've been talking about men and women who come to work in this border area, but it's not just men and women who come here, it's also Hijras who come here. So in this border area there's a very big community of Hijras who also participate in the coal industry. And for those of you who don't know what Hijras are traditionally known as a third sex, so they're an indeterminate category of people who are, well, some people say they are neither man nor woman, or you can say they are both man and woman. With such a tautly organised industry as the coal trade is in the borderlands, opportunities for violence and disputes are always very near. This is exacerbated by the uneven sex ratio, soaring alcohol use, and the lack of basic facilities in the area. As a result, depot owners employ Hijras for what they consider to be pragmatic reasons. It is considered less risky and more prudent to exclude women and systematically institutionalize the employment of Hijras who cannot get pregnant during relations with labourers, thus protecting the trade and the business. If women were to be employed by coal importers to work alongside men, the concern is that they will become pregnant. Not only do depot owners not want a succession of expectant female labourers who are then unable to do their jobs, it is also to do with reputation. The discovery that a female worker had become pregnant would bring shame upon the owner and the business. Importantly, this exclusion of women is not to do with the safety and sanctity of women themselves, though of course such discourse is often paid lip service to. Were it to be, the fact that they work outside of the depots in worse conditions than men would be a point of concern. Mohammed is in her 20s and one of a number of new tractor drivers in the coal trade in Borapani. She spends most nights transporting coal sacks from the depot area to the riverbank, where in the mornings they are shipped out to buyers across the country. The work Mohammed does is hard and dangerous. She starts her shift at 6 p.m, finishing just after the Fajr Azan, which is the early morning call to prayer, from the mosque around 5 a.m. Taking it in turn to drive with the man she calls her husband, Mohammed says she enjoys the work she does. Needing to stay awake, they talk to each other all night, telling stories, reciting poetry, singing Bengali pop songs, gossiping and making plans for the future. The winds from the West Kashi hills help cool her mind, she says. A few years ago, Mohammed was a well-known Hijra in Dhaka. So this is Mohammed now talking. I called myself Julie. I had gold jewelry, beautiful saris, status, and a rented apartment. I earned a living by doing hijabiri, which meant going from shop to shop, collecting money from businessmen, sleeping with whoever could afford to pay, and dancing at weddings and birthdays. I did this for many years, and people knew me. A lot of other hijras were jealous of my success. I can speak well, and men liked me. This all changed once I was raped. People, in particular this one businessman, would come to the apartment and force themselves on me. End of quote. Out of curiosity, I asked if the men paid her afterwards. Annoyed by my question, Muhammad replies, quote, "If you don't like someone, it doesn't matter how much they pay. They cannot change your mind. But if you like someone, then you can even do it for free." End of quote. She continues, "My mind was bad from the experiences and I left Dhaka. Other than my gold and saris, I sold everything else and moved to Sylhet. I lived there for a while, again doing hijragiri. Then one year, I went to the Shah Arafin Bazaar, which is the shrine of a local saint, to pay my respects. I met another hijra there. It was from him that I first heard about Borapani. Afterwards, I left Sylhet for my home village where I spent some time working on the family rice field. My mind was still bad from what had happened in Dhaka. One day, I had enough of working on the fields and decided to come to Borapani, where I met Abed. He took me as his disciple, gave me food, a place to stay, and found me a job as a cook for the then officer at the customs house. I've been here for 2 years now. I am a hijra, yes, but I don't want to do hijragiri. Though driving is hard, I prefer it to what I used to be." The hijras are an integral part of the human and social landscape the coal industry has carved out for itself and is thoroughly interwoven with the need for a particular public and private life. The majority are semi-permanently settled migrant workers from other parts of Bangladesh who work as cooks in the coal import businesses. "We are physically men, but have the hearts and minds of women," they say. With their overt and garish caricature of femininity, they are very distinct in appearance, behavior, and presence in comparison to other manual laborers in the area, both male and female. Sauntering through the bazaar while on the quest for provisions, they flirt with sellers as they haggle over prices, wink as they twirl scarves at rifle-wielding Bangladesh border guards, and fend off advances from motorbike drivers who courier coal merchants to and from Sunamganj. The hijras are attracted to the area for the abundance of work and the well-established community. As Muhammad articulates, she is able to earn a living here by doing jobs other than hijragiri, the role traditionally expected of people such as her. They say there are over 140 members who work as cooks alone. The total number is many more, as not all hijras work for the depots. Other than cooking, they manage the upkeep of the coal depot office and living areas, officiate security, handle petty cash, and deal with coal traders. In addition, hijras work as coal heavers on both sides of the border, labour leaders, truck and tractor drivers, serving staff in tea shops, illicit coal miners on the Indian side, and servants in the Bangladeshi border guard camp stationed in the locality. Abed is Muhammad's guru, which means teacher. He is the most senior of the Borapani hijras. All of his disciples are based in Borapani, and most are involved in various aspects of the border economy. The guru-disciple relationship is the defining characteristic of hijra culture and society. It designates formal membership within the hijra community and delineates the lineage of an individual. It is through the guru-disciple network that information, gossip, news and knowledge are transmitted across time and space, placing an individual into an established hierarchy of seniority. All hijras in Borapani are connected to the House of Beauty hijra. She's apparently a middle-aged hijra who lives in Dhaka. What is important to note here is that the formation of this community in the border area is very much related to the, of course, the economy itself, but also the collapse of the project. Because the project, no one I spoke to remembers the Hijras actually ever being a part of the border until the project shut down. So the reason why the Hijras are very much here is, as I say, to do with the project and to do with the collapse of the Konigat project. A new development in their community is that many of these Hijras are marrying Indian coal men, and they are also migrating into India. So their community is very is very expansive, both in the Indian northeast, Dhaka, Sylhet, and also Calcutta. I might end there. I'm not sure if I've gone over time.
I think we have some time for some questions.
Okay. But yeah, so as I say, these are just extracts from the book. So yeah.
We have time for a few questions, so I think this gentleman will know.
My question is actually about partitioning of whole of Bengal and Assam. Would you like to take that question rather than your specific area?
I could try.
Okay. If we have to take Lord Attlee's announcement on 3rd of June 1947 for the partitioning, he said that the 1941 census is to be used for partitioning. If that was to be followed, then East Pakistan should have had Murshidabad, Nadia, Malda, Bonagram in the west, Agartala and Karimganj in the east, and Chittagong hill tracts would have been East Pakistan. But Lord Radcliffe changed it all under the direction of Lord Mountbatten to give India the advantage to have complete control over Hooghly River. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Well, I suppose I can speak up, from the perspective of my work. I mean, this kind of formal history is very known to the people in the border region, but it's of no use to them because really they're coming to the border to work, to survive. So, it's the sort of thing that is great to be discussed in, universities and history departments and South Asia centres across the country. But for people who live in the borders themselves, they're two different worlds. For them, it is a world of survival. So some of the kind of different characters and communities that I've been writing about who come to the border, they are some of the most marginal and exploited people, and yeah. So I suppose I can. That's all I can say.
Can I take it up with you privately later on? Would you be interested in that? Because I can give you a lot of data.
Oh yeah. Well, I think I've kind of read a lot of those books, and I'm kind of, yeah.
First time.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to that later. No, that's it.
Which one?
No.
Raise hand.
No, that's it. Yes?
Behind you.
Thanks, Delwar. It was a very vivid picture that you drew of the border region. But I was wondering, in Bangladesh, the border, the issues that we discuss as far as border is concerned has to do with, it has a very different picture than the one you've drawn. It's the tension between India and Bangladesh. It's the trade of, how every other week or every month there's a shootout and Bangladeshi citizens are killed. And it has now come to a point where it has started to put strain on the India-Bangladesh borders, and it's increasingly become very politicized and discussed widely within the political sphere of Bangladesh, between particularly the two parties, and it's very sentimental issues for Bangladeshi people. But the border that you described is almost has nothing in common with the picture we get from the newspapers of how India-Bangladesh border is. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is that why is this history, or why is this experience that you have described, is, if I may use the word undermined from your title, why do you think this is undermined? And I guess my second question kind of would be that, Van Shanto has argued in his Bengal borderland that borders are usually, I mean this is Bangladesh-India border is no exception, are places where you feel the full force of the state, right? This is people who live in the core, as opposed to the people who live in the peripheries, have different experiences of the state and how the state manifests itself. So, but I'm surprised in this case, what you have, your experience of in that area is that the state is almost non-present. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk about that.
Thanks. Two very good questions. The first one, I suppose, is this kind of classic academic pattern of top-down versus grassroots. And the top-down story is that poor Bangladeshis are being killed by the horrible Indians, and we need to do something about it. Actually, in fact, while I was doing field work for my PhD, I thought I'd explore that story too. What is actually going on with these deaths? So I went to Burimari in Rajshahi to go and interview the family of a 14-year-old boy who was shot by the Indian border guards. And what I found was that the 14-year-old lives in a border village, and he and his family, and the local villagers are all involved in the illicit cattle trade. And what became apparent was that instead of this being this kind of very convenient narrative that this is about nationalisms, this is about Bangladeshis, and it's about Indians, what it became obvious was that these were local rivalries, local smuggling outfits, and often one group of people feeling that they are being cheated by another group of people. And in this case, it's border guards feeling that they are being undermined by a local partner. So there was this radical difference between this kind of nationalist narrative that this is poor, marginal, exploited Bangladeshi farmers being killed by Indian border guards. I mean, of course it shouldn't happen, but by going there and writing about it, the story became much more complicated. It wasn't about nationalism. And so where does my story fit in to this kind of larger narrative? Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to do work, why I wanted to live here, is because it was safe. There hadn't been shootings. In a lot of other parts of the border, there were where the cattle smuggling or alcohol smuggling or all sorts of other smuggling is taking place. It's incredibly violent, and I don't want to go and risk my life for an anthropological academic endeavour. So I stayed here, and the reason why it's safe, and it's something that both Bangladeshi and Indian government should think a bit more about, is that trade is allowed to happen. So the cattle, the alcohol, all of that kind of stuff elsewhere is not allowed to happen. Hence why there are varying different kind of gangs and characters. Here, the trade is allowed to happen, and that's why it's safe. It is legal, of course, but I mean, it is in this kind of strange position of it being illegal. It's the same with coal. It is very legal for Bangladeshis to buy coal, but of course there's massive layers involved in that. And in this case, the coal, the people who are extracting the coal are crossing the border, and that's illegal. So I don't think we need to, the Bangladesh-India border is one of the biggest in the world. I mean, we can't possibly have the same story that for all of the regions. You know, in each region there are very, very different stories. The Chittagong Hill Tract border region has a very different history and a very different narrative to tell to the Jeshore border. And that has a very different narrative to the Cooch Behar border, and that has a very different history to the Sylhet bit. I mean, as this gentleman was talking about, well, actually Sylhet, I was very interested in the history of Sylhet, and I wanted my work to be about you know, what happened post-partition in Sylhet. Now that border story is very different to Chittagong, and this is very different to all these things. So I don't think we need to reduce everything down to this kind of one nationalist rhetoric of the Indians are killing these poor Bangladeshis. I don't think it's that. I think it's many, many things. And the second question, why is the state? As I said, these are just extracts from a couple of chapters. The state, the state I write about, and it's one of the chapters that I didn't read out today. But the state is very interesting. In the 1960s, when the Konigat limestone mining project was set up, we could say the state had this kind of was a big state. It provided healthcare, education, electricity, all sorts of things, pensions to the people who worked in this thing. So it was a big state. Now what we find is it's a small state. There is no state presence other than border guards, customs, and that should say something about the role of the state. It is about military and it is about extraction, financial extraction. You know, the state is not providing anything else. In this area, and like a lot of other parts of Bangladesh, it is not the state that provides, it's private NGOs that provide. You know, there's Norwegian NGOs in these remote parts of the Bangladesh-India border. You know, the Norwegian state has a greater footprint in the border than the Bangladeshi state. You know, other than if you discount the military and if you discount the customs. So yes, I do have state, and I like talking about the state. Chapter 5.
We're running out of time, but there's two people here. You're right. Then we just go to that. Either lady or man, whatever. I can't see it in the light.
That was really extremely interesting. I really enjoyed it. What year was the fence actually physically constructed at Borapani? When did the fence actually physically appear?
Borapani has no fence.
It still has no fence.
It still has no
when
fence.
you showed the road,
So that was carved.
Okay.
And I mean, that's one of the stories about, I mean, this is the top-down versus the kind of local realities. So the border building project, this current big one was a BJP one. So it's not even this current Congress government that did it, it's the previous one. So it's very old, but they still haven't come round
So
to building.
where is the fence exactly?
So it's in other parts of Sunamganj.
Right.
I mean, it goes all over the place, but they're not all connected.
Right, so there's chunks of fence.
Yeah.
And my other question is, because actually I've recently been on the Cooch Behar border, and I saw the fence, and we encountered the Indian Army post as well. And but none of I was wondering who was actually manning the post, because they weren't. The army in Cooch Behar were not Bengalis, and they couldn't speak a word of local language. They were from other parts of India, Hindi speakers, and they couldn't communicate. And when we were there, they were speaking to us in English, and they wanted to know what all the local villagers were doing, and they couldn't communicate in any Bengali whatsoever. And I was wondering who the people manning the posts in Borapani were. Were they Bengali speakers, or were they from other areas? What happened linguistically?
Well, the northeast is fascinating because we often think that Kashmir is the kind of sore point in India, but in fact it's the northeast. There are more soldiers in the northeast. I mean, it's huge amounts. I mean, the concern in the northeast is China. It's not, of course, Bangladesh. And so there's garrisons and cantonments dotted around all over. So anyone who has travelled from Sylhet to Shillong will in fact pass these cantonments. And the Indian military works in a very, of course they're remnants of the British military.
Yes.
So in terms of structure, the Bangladesh and the Indian is not too dissimilar, but the makeup of the military is very different, because in Bangladesh you mostly get Bengalis. You might get the odd Pahari individual, who are there, but on the whole they're mostly Bengali. So wherever a Bengali is posted, largely they are male. He can still speak Bengali with the local population, but they will often make sure that a Sylheti is not posted in Sylheti but to Chittagong. So they will try and do that. In India, there's people from all across the Indians, in India, and so they have all different languages. In Borapani, I met Sikhs, I met Gujaratis, a lot of South Indians. There were a couple of Bengalis, but Bengalis aren't really military people. They don't really join the military. They might have admin jobs in the cantonments themselves, but they're not out stationed manning the borders. So that, I wonder if that's part of one of the reasons why you didn't encounter any. They're too short.
I think unfortunately we have to end now on this one. Thank you, Delwar. Yeah.